Hi. Hello, everyone. If we can take our seats. Can people hear me? Can people hear me now? Is that a little better? Yeah. Terrific. If we can all just take our seats. That's great. My name's Dan Steiner. I'm the president of Temple Shalom, and I'd just like to welcome everyone to our synagogue this evening. And I'd also like to thank in particular Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver, the Rabbinical Association of Vancouver, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, or CIJA, Beth Israel, Shar Tzedek, and Beth Tikva for partnering with us on what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting and informative evening. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Temple Shalom Senior Rabbi, Dan Moskowitz.
They usually only applaud when I say we're going to go to the Oneg. Like that's when the applause usually comes. Thank you all for being here so much, and I want to thank our staff for setting up the room, and for all of you for signing up for this evening and for coming out. We're really honored to have Yossi here. You know, it's good to see you. Welcome back. It's no, the other Yossi, but it's good to see you all. But Ilan is here, so it's good to see you. It's just such a privilege to be able to do this in our community. As you probably heard, Yossi has ties to the community that run deeper than just our congregation, but family ties as well. So to be able to be part of your family and to have Sarah here also, where she went, there she is. There she is tremendous. I want to also acknowledge and welcome our MLA, Mike Lee, who is here. Mike, who's... Mike, who attends almost as many Jewish events as I do and Ezra does. I'm going to say this seriously, and I hope that you'll give the same welcome to Talib Nur Muhammad in a moment. Wait, you don't have to, but I'm going to say what I'm going to say, okay? Because I've worked with Talib on many, many things, and he worked very hard to make sure that the motion that came through, and I didn't want to see that motion at all, but he worked very hard to make sure that it did not break new ground, and that's an important thing. So I want to welcome Talib Nur Muhammad, who's here. Thank you. Thank you all for that. And it's my pleasure to introduce Ezra Shankin, the CEO of our Jewish Federation, to share a few words of welcome.
Friends, it seems that Yossi couldn't come at a better time for all of us. Voices like Yossi's are clarion voices of truth in an incredibly post-truth era. Never did I believe as a Jew that I would be accused of genocide, a word that was created to describe the destruction of my own people. Never would I have ever thought that that word would be cheapened to such a level that it's thrown around like any other word. The way that we saw Holocaust misappropriation during COVID, so much has been stolen of our narrative in this moment. So much that we held on to as sacred has been now made profane. I take that very seriously day in and day out. You know I do. And I do want to say that any time that political leaders come and spend time with us, it matters to me. Time is one of their greatest commodities, and the fact, regardless of the hard decisions they make day in and day out, we don't always agree on everything that we do, but that they then choose to be here with us and to spend what little time they have away from their family to be here matters to me, and I want to say I deeply appreciate seeing that. The last thing that I want to say is this. We have been incredibly lucky to have an incredible group of folks under the umbrella of ACART, our Anti-Semitism Israel Crisis Response Team, that Rabbi Dan, right after October 7th, came forward with Nico Slabinski from our CJA office and said, we'll lead this. And obviously I said to Rabbi Dan, and I want this to go on record for all of you Temple Shalom members, I said, but you have a shul. You can't let your members down. And he said that you guys would want him to do this. Now, I didn't know if that was a bad thing or a good thing. But what Dan has done, and now Jason Murray has taken over for him, and the committees have worked on in the legal field, our teachers, my God, our teachers have been fighting for the last few days at their union meetings. I see some of them here. I see some of them here. To just bring a sense of equality to the narrative. Our lawyers who are fighting day in and day out to find legal ways to protect our students on campus and in other places. Our doctors who have organized now under an umbrella of a new organization with logo and all for allied health trades, because they saw within our hospitals and our medical schools that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel was creeping in like a poison, and that they needed to come together. Over 180 doctors have come together with additional allied health professional tradespeople to bring a collective voice to the medical field and have a strong voice in standing up for medical students and standing up for fellows and standing up for doctors and standing up for nurses and all other allied health professions. And I want to give them a round of applause. So with that, I don't want to be the one to stand in the way of what I believe is going to be incredibly profound words from our incredible guest. Other than the last thank you I want to give out is to your daughter for moving here. What a coup. If only we could take credit for that move. My God, would we be strategic. So I want to thank everybody for coming here, for supporting, for continuing to stand with our community during these fragile times. What we have in these times more than ever is each other, and we have to remember that that is where our strength comes from. It comes from coming together with each other. And so please, please don't ever forget to be there for one another, to embrace one another in these moments, in these challenging moments. Look to your right and look to your left and put your arm around your friends, and we will be there together, and I promise you we will come through stronger than ever before. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm Rabbi Tendler, the rabbi at Beth Tikva in Richmond. I spent a good portion of today in advance going through about a decade's worth of lectures that I've attended with you and different notes that I've kept, because I find them to be always poignant, relevant, timeless. So for example, Ezra, as you said that, I was surprised that in a Zionist rabbinic coalition before the High Holidays meeting in 2021, after a skirmish with Gaza, you were speaking to the fact that terms like apartheid and colonialism had moved over to genocide, and to speaking about the fear of the fact that in normative language we were starting to use these terms that should never be used. And I thought, but that was 2021. That's exactly what we're feeling today. And over again in a decade's worth of lectures that I've attended with you, I found each one so relevant to today. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Yossi Klein Halevi, who is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, together with Imam Abdullah and Antepli of Duke University and Jennifer Raskis. He co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. He's a prolific author, most notably of the 2018 New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. While this is just one of several award-winning books, his articles can be found in the op-ed pages of leading newspapers, and he serves as a co-host with Danielle Hartman and Alana Stein-Hain of the Institute's award-winning and, in fact, the #1 Jewish podcast in the English-speaking world. The podcast is called For Heaven's Sake. If you haven't already checked it out, you should. Born in New York, he made Aliyah more than 40 years ago, where he and his wife, Sarah, when they're not here, live in just the last row of houses in Jerusalem, overlooking the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria, or what today is better known as the West Bank. Self-identified as a centrist, what always inspires me is that you seek to make room for every voice and find it so important to do so. And you do so with empathy and the strong conviction of moral authority, seeking the humanity of every individual. Just a quick note from, there are 2 notes from the lectures that I thought I would bring today, which was that in 2015 at AIPAC, my notes read that there would always be moments in history where we must stand alone with our truth and with the responsibility and privilege. And we learned this from the beginnings of our narrative, that Avram Avinu was also Avram HaIvri, the other side. And you shared that, of course, Israel will never stand alone as long as we from all around stand with her. And in 2021, you said, you can never freeze the frame and say this is Israel, because the Israeli reality is so fluid, so dynamic, that we can be in one seemingly impossible situation and then suddenly find ourselves in almost the opposite situation. May it be so that we find that soon. And I look forward to hearing the optimism that you brought to us, the moments that the rabbi stepped off the plane in Jerusalem, where you invited us to your home, and things have their own way of working out, but you met us to light the Chanukiah nonetheless. And it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce Yossi Klein Halevi.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Rabbi, thank you for that just wonderful, wonderful introduction. And Ezra, thank you for your warm words. And Rabbi Dan, where are you? As always, your incredible hospitality and warmth and friendship. Deeply grateful. The last time I spoke at this podium was this past Rosh Hashanah. And those of you who are here may recall that I spoke about the democracy movement in Israel. And that feels as if it was about 10 years ago. This is the first time that I've been out of Israel since October 7th. And I have to tell you that it feels profoundly disorienting. In one way, it's a tremendous relief, because Israel, since October 7th, has been relentlessly grieving and in a state of overwhelming emotion, rage, fear. And Israelis have always been adept at the pretense of normalcy. We were always able to maintain at least some semblance of normal life, no matter what was happening in the country. Since October 7th, that ability has frayed. And just the other day, a friend of mine told me that she was online at the supermarket, and the checkout woman just began weeping. And everyone online, of course, understood. So there I go. And what you find in Israel today is that October 7th never stopped. And the rest of the world, understandably, has moved on. The devastation in Gaza, the tremendous suffering in Gaza has riveted world attention. But in Israel, it's still October 7th. We are still trying to figure out what happened on that day. First of all, trying to figure out the details, because there seems to be an endless amount of stories that remain to be told. And so on one level, we're all in the process of gathering information still. But being away from Israel is more complicated than I assumed. Obviously, leaving Israel and leaving family and friends behind and not knowing what's going to happen literally from day to day. Are we going to go into Rafah? Will the war intensify? Will it wind down? Will the hostages, many of the hostages be released? Will war expand in the north? And what will that look like? At any moment, that can happen. And so there's this wrenching sense of separation from Israel at its most desperate moment. So on the one hand, relief, on the other hand, a sense of dislocation. But there's also something deeper that I realized is at work, and I realized it when I got here. And that is that Israel, since October 7th, is the most dangerous place in the world to be a Jew physically. But it is the safest place in the world to be a Jew psychologically. And that's something that many Israelis haven't yet internalized of what the diaspora is going through. And this is the first time in the history of the Israeli-North American Jewish relationship, and I'm specifically speaking about North American Jewry because other parts of the diaspora have felt vulnerable for a long time, Europe, Latin America, certainly. But what's changed in our relationship is that for the first time, Israelis and North American Jews are feeling vulnerable together at the same time. In different ways, there are variations of vulnerability, but we have never felt the way we do today. We all woke up on October 8th realizing that none of us was as safe as we assumed we were. And what I've discovered here, in small ways that will be much more familiar to all of you than to me as an Israeli, is how every conversation is fraught. You just never know where it's going to go to. And in Israel, when I say that we are psychologically safe, you know that everyone is going through the same emotional trajectory. And that's something that creates a sense of stability that we in Israel take for granted, but is really one of the precious gifts of living in Israel at this time. This is the most lonely time since the Holocaust to be a Jew. And the fact that so many people who we expected to be allies, emotional allies, were not present on October 8th. The fact that so many people who we expected at least some level of empathy from don't understand what we're going through, but even more seriously, somehow deny us the right to feel vulnerable because we are exercising our power in Gaza, because we made a decision on October 8th not to be the underdog. That was a deliberate decision by Israelis to own the power that we have, to hit back in the way that any country in our place would have done, if not more so. And yet, the capacity of people to hold two ideas at the same time, which is, yes, Israel is powerful, and we're glad for that. But at the same time, the Jews can be vulnerable, not victims. We're not victims. And again, that's the message of October 7th. Hamas attempted to return us to the condition of victimhood. The Israeli response on October 8th was, we are not going back to the condition of victimhood. So this is not about self-pity. This is not about a victimhood competition with the Palestinians. They will always win that competition. And I, for one, have no regrets in losing that competition. On the other hand, the Jews today are vulnerable in Israel and around the world in ways that we have not been for 80 years. And the fact that so few people around the world seem capable of understanding that nuance is really contributing to the depth of Jewish aloneness. Now, just before this talk, Rabbi Dan and I were sitting in his study and pondering the question, how do we understand this strange moment? How is it possible that we're seeing the worst outbreak of anti-Semitism and maybe the most global outbreak of anti-Semitism in history, thanks in large part to social media? This is an outbreak that we've never experienced before in these dimensions. How is it possible that that happened after October 7th and to a large extent in response not only to October 8th, not only to what Israel did in response to October 7th, but we saw the response to October 7th happening on that very day? How is that possible? What is it that we didn't quite understand about the nature of anti-Semitism, about the position of the Jews in the world, including in the West? What we experienced on October 7th was a pre-enactment of Hamas's genocidal intent. That was a microcosmic genocidal event. And yet we, as Ezra noted, we are accused, we stand accused of committing genocide. How is it possible that just as Hamas revealed to the world what from the river to the sea would actually look like if they were ever in control from the river to the sea? How is it possible that precisely that moment when the genocidal nature of that slogan became apparent, that from the river to the sea became a mainstream idea, chanted on liberal campuses across the West? We in Israel, and I believe most Jews in the diaspora, see this war in the context of a war against evil. Israel is fighting a profound outbreak of evil. And our critics agree that this is a war between good and evil, but we are cast in the role of evil. How did we get to this radical disconnect? Now, there's a paradox here from an Israeli perspective. Israel's most controversial war, most brutal war, enjoys a level of national support in Israel the likes of which we haven't seen probably since the Second Intifada, the wave of suicide bombings and Israel's response. But I would argue even earlier. I don't think we have seen this level of support for a military action, for war, since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Israelis, as you know, disagree about everything. And yet over 90% of Israelis continue to support this war, despite the ugliness, despite what this war is doing to Gaza, despite what this war is doing to Israel around the world, despite the undeniable moral burden that we are carrying because of this war. Over 90%, which means most of the Israeli left and the center, not only the right, supports this war. Now, we're still arguing. We're still debating. There are demonstrations every week on the streets against the government, to bring the government down in support of the hostages. But even those anti-government demonstrations are not against the war. Israelis are not demonstrating against the war. In previous wars, we've seen demonstrations. By now, at this point, you would have had demonstrations from the left. It's virtually non-existent. Most Israelis agree that our most brutal war is also one of our most necessary wars. Now, when I try to understand the Israeli left, how is it that the Israeli left is, for the most part, on board with this war? I think that what the Israeli left understands, which is something that the left around the world does not understand, is that this is not a war about the occupation. Regardless of what one thinks about the occupation, this war has nothing to do with the occupation. It is instead a war of radical Islamism to destroy the state of Israel. And Hamas, when it spoke initially, after October 7th, when it spoke about its attacks on the kibbutzim and towns along the Gaza border, revealingly used the language of settlements. In fact, when Hamas speaks about Tel Aviv is a settlement. Israel is one, from Hamas's perspective, illegal settlement. And so the Israeli left understands that this is one of those existential moments that will define the future of Israel. And that is what has allowed us as a society to put aside the profound disagreements that we had before October 7th and that we're going to have when this war is over. The day after this war is over, it will be back to normal in Israel. But for the duration, we have managed, astonishingly, to maintain a level of cohesiveness that really we haven't seen in Israeli society for a very long time. And bear in mind that this cohesiveness follows our most divisive year, the most divisive year in Israel's history. Many of us were out on the streets demonstrating against this terrible government every week, sometimes a few times a week. And yet when October 7th happened, we immediately pivoted. This war is being condemned around the world as Netanyahu's war. This is not Netanyahu's war. This is my war. This is the war of the people of Israel. The fact that Netanyahu happens to be the official face of this war is a tragedy for Israel. We are acting, those of us who oppose Netanyahu, and by now the polls show it's about 85% of the Israeli public that wants Netanyahu to resign when this war is over. We're acting as if Netanyahu doesn't matter. This is our war. I mentioned a moment ago that Israelis perceive this war as existential. And I think this is a crucial piece that much of the world has not internalized. When I listen to American critics, for example, speak about the war, they frame it in categories that are American. This is Israel's Afghanistan, this is Israel's Iraq. For Israelis, this is our World War II. And what makes this war existential is that what we are fighting for is restoring the credibility of Israeli deterrence and of the Zionist promise to the Jewish people to create a safe refuge. And I'd like to just briefly unpack these 2 points. We are a country that sent commandos halfway across Africa in 1976 to rescue 100 Israeli hostages held at Antepli airport. And yet on October 7th, we couldn't save 1,200 of our fellow citizens within the sovereign borders of the State of Israel. October 7th was a spiritually existential challenge to Israel's credibility as a safe refuge for the Jewish people. And so the first order of business in this war, what we are trying to restore, is the credibility of the covenant that Zionism made with the Jewish people, that there would be one place that you could depend on to protect the Jewish people. And it's not that 1,200 Jews were killed on October 7th. It's that they were killed in a state of helplessness, that the army couldn't protect them. This is the existential, spiritual crisis of October 7th, and it is an existential crisis for Zionism. The fact that we have tens of thousands of internal refugees from the southern border and the northern border who don't feel safe to live in their homes any longer is an existential crisis for Israel, for the promise of creating a safe refuge. And so the first goal of this war is to restore that promise that was shattered on October 7th. The second goal of the war is to restore the credibility of our military deterrence. We will not be able to survive in the long term. The lone non-Arab, non-Muslim country for thousands of kilometers around us will not be able to survive in the Middle East if we fail to project a credible military deterrence. On October 7th, we lost our deterrence. About 10 years ago, the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, made a speech in which he predicted the eventual destruction of Israel, and he used a metaphor where he compared Israel to a spider web. And it's a very famous metaphor in Israel. You just mentioned the spider web, every Israeli knows what you're talking about. And we made fun of it at the time. We're not laughing about it anymore. And what Nasrallah said then was that just as a spider web appears to be formidable from without, with a single swipe it disintegrates. October 7th was the swipe of the spider web. In some sense, this is the war of the spider web. This is the war to undo the disastrous perception of October 7th that Israel's military credibility, that our ability to defend ourselves was a myth. That's what we are trying to reestablish in this war. We lived for the last 2 decades or so with a very comforting illusion that it was possible to coexist with genocidal regimes and terror entities on most of our borders and continue to live our daily lives. And what we learned on October 7th is that when your neighbors tell you that they intend to destroy you, one of these days you will wake up to that reality. Now, if Israel fails to destroy the regime that did that to the Jewish people, our credibility will be severely compromised. And when I say that this is an existential war, I don't mean that if we fail to achieve our goals, we will be existentially threatened in an immediate sense. But it will, I believe, be the beginning of a process of long-term decline for Israel. And we all know it. And that goes a long way to explaining the extraordinary morale that we're seeing in Israel, that we're seeing in the IDF. We have not seen this level of morale in many, many years. We have soldiers who were wounded and insisted on returning to their units. I read an interview recently with an officer who was wounded twice and kept returning to Gaza. That's Israel today. It's a different country from the Israel of October 6th. Now, for Israelis, this war is not just Israel versus Hamas. That's understandably, that's the perception around the world. It's mighty Israel against the relatively powerless Palestinians. That's not the way we experience this war. For us, this is really the beginning of the Israeli-Iranian war. The war with Hamas is the first stage, the first front, and I believe that that front will inevitably, sooner or later, move to the north, because otherwise we will lose the north. Israelis will not go back to their homes with Hezbollah sitting literally on their border. You can sit in Metula, the northernmost village in Israel. You can sit on your porch and look across the border and see Hezbollah. That's now untenable. And so sooner or later, war will come to the north, and we all know it. And we also know this is going to be a far more terrible war than the war with Hamas. This is going to be, God forbid, a war of the cities. Hezbollah has something like 150,000 missiles and rockets aimed at the Israeli home front. This will be the war of the Israeli home front. Iran's strategic victory, a historic victory, has been to surround Israel with its proxies, sitting on our borders. Iran is no longer thousands of kilometers away. It is literally on our borders. And that, after October 7th, is an untenable situation. Now, when I say that this is Israel's most brutal war and also one of Israel's most necessary, what I mean is that not only are we seeing tremendous civilian casualties in Gaza, but we have necessarily loosened the rules of military engagement so that we no longer take the precautions that we did in previous conflicts. For example, the knock on the roof. There are all kinds of ways in which we're fighting this war that are appropriate to the goal of destroying Hamas, but which necessarily means higher civilian casualties. The decision that Israel made, and which we all signed up to in Israel, was that this time Hamas would not enjoy immunity behind their civilians. Now, we do not deliberately target civilians. That is the great lie of this war. But are we taking all the precautions that we did in the past? The answer is no. And again, if we are going to deny Hamas the immunity that it enjoyed until October 7th, that by necessity means we go into hospitals if the Hamas senior command is there, as we are right now back in Shifa Hospital. We go into mosques. We go into schools. We certainly go into UN facilities, which are often thinly disguised fronts for Hamas. the nature of the war that we're fighting is impossible. I have a friend who came back recently from Gaza, and he just told me a small story. And you can multiply this story by thousands. He said that his unit discovered the opening of a tunnel inside a water purification installation. And there was a sign, a plaque on the installation. This is a gift from the people of Germany to the people of Gaza. And so Hamas has militarized the entire civilian infrastructure. There is, for all practical purposes, no distinction between the Hamas infrastructure and the civilian life. At the same time, when I say that we have no choice but to fight this war as we are, that does not mean that we should be immune from penetrating questions from our friends. For those who accuse Israel of being an illegitimate state, for those who say Israel has no right to defend itself because it's an occupier, because it's colonialist apartheid, I owe no moral accounting. But I do owe a moral accounting, for example, to the Biden administration. I don't think I owe a moral accounting anymore to the Trudeau administration. But certainly when our friends who have stood by us courageously do deserve answers to difficult questions. Can I honestly say that we have taken all the precautions, even within the constraints of the nature of this war that we're fighting? Have we taken all the precautions that we should? Have we been looser than we should in certain areas? I can't stand here and tell you honestly that we have. There was tremendous rage in Israel after October 7th, and that rage was transferred to the soldiers out in the front. That was a very dangerous situation. You're sending an army into a civilian population that's in a condition of rage. And so there are questions, necessary questions, that we as a people need to ask ourselves. For example, why is it that the Biden administration needed to airlift food to civilians in Gaza? Shouldn't that have been an Israeli initiative? Shouldn't that be what a Jewish state does, minimally? And so there are questions here. There are questions. And what I believe we need to learn as a people, Israelis and diaspora Jews alike, are how to speak two languages simultaneously about Israel. On the one hand, unequivocal pushback against attempts to criminalize Israel. On the other hand, asking ourselves the question, are we really comfortable being compared, for example, to Sudan? And this is one of the lines of defense, and I've used it too. When the UN Secretary General says this is the worst civilian disaster that he's seen in his term as UN Secretary General, my immediate pushback was, well, what about Darfur? So that's a legitimate pushback to our enemies. But in our internal conversation, we need to ask ourselves, are we really comfortable being in that category? Is that the frame of reference that the Jewish state is now in? We're better than Sudan. That's a question we need to ask ourselves. And we need to learn how to speak these two languages compellingly and without confusing the two. We need to know which language is appropriate in which situation. How did we get to this point? How did we get to this point where we are the perpetrators of genocide after experiencing a genocidal assault? We are at the culminating moment of decades of a war of attrition aimed at the Jewish story. We're now seeing the results of something that we largely ignored all these years. This is now the cumulative impact of decades of delegitimization, of a systematic assault on the legitimacy of the Jewish return home. Every stage of the Zionist and Israeli story has been delegitimized, beginning with the origins of Zionism, which has been reduced to one more expression of Western colonialism. Not an indigenous people returning home, but simply one more expression of Western greed and expansionism. The 1948 war, the founding of Israel, has been reduced to Nakba, ethnic cleansing, as if the Arab armies that invaded Israel didn't attempt a Nakba. Everywhere where Arab armies were victorious in the 1948 war, Jews were completely either massacred or expelled. The only reason that more of them were expelled than more of us is because we won. And then, of course, immediately after the 1948 war, the mass expulsion began of Jews throughout the Arab world. Close to 1 million Jews from the most ancient diasporas were forced to leave, fled within the next 2 decades. Today, there are 40,000 Jews left in the Arab world, and 1.8 million Arabs living in the state of Israel. So which, if we're talking about Nakba, one needs to also have some proportion there. Post-1967, Israel has been reduced to an apartheid state. And just one small example of the absurdity of that accusation from my own life. I live in an apartment building in French Hill neighborhood in Jerusalem. Literally half the families in our building are Jewish Israeli, half are Arab Israeli. Next door, on top. And I can't tell you that it's always comfortable, but we certainly maintain the basic norms of neighborly relations. And now we've come to the final stop in this trajectory of pre-state colonialism, 1948 Nakba, post-67 apartheid, and now we come to genocide. But what's happened in this war is that, for a long time now, our enemies have tried to label us as Nazi. But now there's been an escalation. Not only are we the new Nazis, but we deserve the next Holocaust because we are Nazis. And so October 7th can be not only justified, but celebrated because we are the new Nazis and we are perpetrating a Holocaust. And so those who are intending, God forbid, another Holocaust are invoking the Holocaust against us. This is a complicated moment that we haven't begun to unpack on so many layers. There are so many layers to try to sort out. The challenge of our generation, the challenge of the Jewish people in the 21st century, is to defend the Jewish story of the 20th century. The Jewish story of post-Holocaust recovery, the extraordinary story of the Jewish reclamation of power, how we moved from the lowest point of powerlessness in our history to the peak point of power today, again, without apologies, with celebration. And this is the story that is now being systematically dismantled, and this is the story we have to uphold. So much to say. A word about power. and October 7th and October 8th. We are caught today in this psychological warp where much of the world, maybe most of the world now, perceives us as victimizers, while we are still in October 7th and are still carrying the trauma of renewed victimization. And I would urge you all to extricate ourselves from this dichotomy of victim and victimizer, because neither category, I believe, is relevant. We are not victimizers. Regardless of the devastation in Gaza, we are a people that is defending itself. Neither are we victims because of the devastation in Gaza, because we have the power to defend ourselves. October 7th failed. And this is really important for us to internalize. October 7th was a momentary lapse into victimhood, but October 8th was, again, the decision to undo that disastrous temporary failure. We need to own the consequences of our power, which means avoiding the temptation of seeing ourselves as victims. And I think that we're making the case for this war in the wrong way. And I'm speaking, first of all, about Israel, and I have Netanyahu in particular in mind. He gave a talk the other day where he accused the world of forgetting what Hamas did to us on October 7th. And I had no problem with that speech except for two words: to us. What Hamas did to us. We need to frame this war not about Hamas did this to me and I'm a victim and so I have the right to lash out because of what they did to us. We need to frame this war in terms of look at what Hamas did on October 7th. Look at who they are. Look at what they're capable of. Look at the nature of the enemy that we're facing. Look at the nature of radical Islamism. That is the way that I believe this war needs to be framed. Because if we try to frame this as, look what they did to us, we're the victims, we don't have the credibility of victimhood after the last months of war. Neither should we have the credibility of victimhood. We don't want that identity. The whole point of Zionism was to free us of victimhood, and this is the moment to own that, to own the success of Zionism, and say, yes, this is what a country does when it's subjected, when it's confronted with that kind of enemy. This is what any of you in the world would do in our place, not because of what Hamas did to me, because of what Hamas does, because of what Hamas represents. And that's a strategic argument. That's not an argument that's soliciting the world's sympathy. Israelis always used to say, we'd rather be hated than pitied. You know, be careful what you wish for. But yes, we would rather be hated than pitied. And so this is one of those moments. And so let's own our power without squeamishness, but also without trying to pretend that we're not doing what we're doing. We are devastating Gaza. And that is an expression of our self-defense. The future of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I'll speak for another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open for conversation. We have always had a profound dilemma in trying to determine our relationship with the Palestinian state. I'll speak for myself as someone who is a political centrist. A centrist basically believes two things about a Palestinian state. On the one hand, we must create a Palestinian state, because of demography, because of the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, because of our position in the world. And October 7th only intensifies that argument that if we were not occupying the Palestinians, this war might have been perceived by some in a different way. And so for all those reasons and more, I have always believed we must create a Palestinian state. At the same time, we can't create a Palestinian state because there is no one in the Palestinian leadership, no one, that accepts the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any borders. The Palestinian national movement has never reconciled itself to Israel's existence. And so, how do you make peace with a counterclaimant who believes that you are a thief by nature, that all of this land belongs to them and will one day revert to them? How do you then empower that national movement on your border? Now, October 7th intensified both of those arguments. On the one hand, ask any Israeli today, almost any Israeli, what do you think about a Palestinian state? And the response is, you've got to be out of your mind. And that's obvious. Would we dare to risk replicating the Gaza border on our border with Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, our most sensitive border? That's what it would mean today to create a Palestinian state. And so on the one hand, it's inconceivable. On the other hand, and in Israel there's always another hand, October 7th also proved that Ariel Sharon was right when he withdrew unilaterally from Gaza, because these two peoples cannot live together in one state. We can't coexist between the river and the sea in one big dysfunctional state. It is a disaster. What we would be doing is internalizing the conflict. I would rather deal with the conflict externally, as a border conflict. Although since October 7th, I'm a little less confident of that statement. The Oslo process of the 1990s actually had two camps in Israel that were in favor of those negotiations. And we tend to forget this. There was the Shimon Peres camp that spoke about peace, and there was the Yitzhak Rabin camp that spoke of separation. Rabin never spoke about peace. He said, we're not going to have peace with the Palestinians. He said the reason we need a separate entity, he was careful not to say state, we need a separate Palestinian entity precisely because we can't live in peace together. And so the notion of separation, of divorce, or the way it used to be phrased in the 90s, are we marrying the Palestinians through the Oslo process or are we divorcing them? My sense is that after this war is over, many Israelis will slowly begin to re-examine the argument of separation, the Rabin argument of separation, as a way of conceiving a two-state solution. Now, there will be no two-state solution anytime soon. We're talking about a very gradual, long-term process, if at all, if it happens at all. But for those of us who believe that it is in Israel's best interest to have, in principle, to have these two peoples separated, then there is an argument that I believe will be made with greater and greater force as we distance ourselves from the trauma of October 7th. There's another factor here that we need to consider, and that is that Israel's position in the Middle East has changed in ways that for my generation was once inconceivable. Israel today has Arab allies against Hamas. They're not saying so publicly, there's a certain cowardice at play, but we know from the messages that we're getting privately from Arab leaders that they're angry at Israel not because we're destroying Hamas, but because we're hesitating. That's the anger that you hear from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf states. And so our strategic position in the region has changed dramatically. The fact that Israel has Arab allies, which is a term that I never thought I would ever use, means that we can now conceive of a possible framework for dealing with the Palestinians within a regional context, within a regional peace agreement. Now, this conflict was never just about Israel and the Palestinians. It was always a regional conflict. For most of Israel's existence, it was a Sunni Israeli war. Today, it's a Shiite Israeli war. It's still a regional war, but the parts of the region that are the front lines have shifted. And what that means is that a regional conflict, a regional war, requires regional peace. And for the first time, there's that possibility. And so we need to keep that in our minds, even as we rage and grieve. There is a possibility, and it's not more than that, but there is a possibility that didn't exist before. And my final comments are about why I'm hopeful about Israel. This government, I referred to it earlier as this terrible government, and I was being deliberately understated. This government has lost. And the democracy movement, which was the most extraordinary protest movement in Israel's history, and I think one of the most extraordinary democratic movements in the world, we won. We stopped this government from destroying Israeli democracy. And now our struggle against this government is by no means over. Netanyahu is not going peacefully. But the experiment of an ultra-nationalist, ultra-Orthodox coalition presided over by a fundamentally corrupt politician is over. That failed, and you see it in the polls. Every poll shows that this configuration is going down. Now, Ben Gvir is rising in the polls, but the general coalition has been destroyed. And so what we are looking at in post-October 7th Israel, I believe, is going to be a return to stability, to sanity, whether it will be a rational right-wing government or a center-left, center-right coalition. Israel, I believe, is moving back toward reason. And we're also seeing, or we will see, the emergence of a new generation of leaders coming from two sources. First, the protest movement. There are some extraordinary young people that have emerged in that movement. And secondly, from the reservists coming back from the front. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have experienced in the most personal way possible the consequences of a failed government. And so the message that this generation has internalized is you can't leave the governance of the state of Israel to those people, to corrupt politicians. And I think we're going to see some very powerful new voices emerging. This moment, the post-October 7th moment, is, to my mind, the maturation, the expression of the maturation of Israeli society. And I say that because this is the first time that Israel has gone to war with a majority of its people having absolutely no trust in our political leadership. I don't think in the past we could have gone to war under these conditions. A poll was taken shortly after October 7th asking, do you believe that Netanyahu places the interests of the country ahead of his own personal interests or his own interests ahead of the country? 60% said personal interests. I was wondering, who are these 40%? And so the fact that we mobilized ourselves, this government not only failed on October 7th, it failed on October 8th. Social services collapsed. We mobilized ourselves. We saved Israeli society. And of course, the army, people showed up to their reservist units who weren't called. It was something like 150% response of reservists to the call-up. And so this is the moment when Israelis have taken responsibility for our own society, more so than any time in the past. Israelis were always this very curious hybrid between a strong ability to respond to external threat and passivity internally. That's over. This is a different country. And so what I believe is that we're going to see a much more mature Israel, a much more mobilized Israel, and also an Israel that does not want to go back to the terrible divisiveness of this last year. We have relearned the habit of national solidarity. And even though we're obviously not going to be able to maintain this level of national cohesiveness when the war is over, there is a very strong determination across the political spectrum not to repeat the last year. About 10 years ago, I published a book called Like Dreamers, which told the story of a group of Israeli paratroopers who fought in Jerusalem in 1967, and it traced the subsequent history of Israel after the Six-Day War through these 7 lives, 7 entwined lives. And one of the heroes of the book, my personal favorite, was someone named Arik Achmon. Arik Achmon was the chief of military intelligence of the paratroopers in 1967. He planned the battle for Jerusalem. He planned the crossing of the Suez Canal in the 1973 war. He was the senior officer who led the crossing. Someone who really is personally responsible for some of Israel's most mythic moments. And Arik became one of my closest friends. And he recently died a couple months ago at the age of 90. And Arik and I had a Shabbat custom. We would speak every Friday afternoon. We would have a conversation reviewing the week's events, what's happening in our personal lives, but more deeply, what's happening in the country. What Israelis call the parliament, where we had a parliament of 2. And after literally every conversation, every Erev Shabbat, I went into Shabbat with Arik saying to me the same thing. He said, Yossi, remember, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. The eternity of Israel will not fail, will not deceive. And when he said that to me the first time, I said, Arik, you're an atheist. What are you telling me about the eternity of Israel? And he said, I don't believe in the God of Israel, but I believe in the people of Israel. And that's what I want to leave you with, that what we've seen in the last year is some of the worst aspects of the self-destructive impulses of the Jewish people played out by this government. And we've seen since October 7th some of the most exalted impulses of the people of Israel. And I believe that if we maintain steadiness as a people, if we continue to show strength, power, if we have the capacity to ask ourselves difficult questions without compromising our commitment to power, if the diaspora-Israel relationship remains strong, then we will get through this and we will once again prevail. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So it'll come as no surprise, Yossi. We have a few questions. Only 4 were given to me ahead of time, but if there were others that had written something on a card, if you want to find their way, help them find their way to me, that would be great. I'll give you a moment to get a drink of water. This question asks you to sort of characterize the state of the Palestinian people. The question asks, I hear that all or almost all the Palestinians are Hamas or supporters of Hamas. Is this true?
No, and if you hear a lilt of a question in my response, that's deliberate. I think that if you ask the question of Palestinians, do you support October 7th, you will get a majority. Do you support Hamas? I don't think you'll get a majority. I think that many, many Palestinians, certainly in Gaza, have had it with Hamas. That's not to say that they don't support October 7th. It's not to say that they're for peace or a two-state solution. Those are separate questions. But if you're asking specifically about Hamas, my sense is that Hamas, after this war, will have lost a great deal of its credibility. And I'll give you one example. I just saw a clip the other day of an interview of a Hamas leader on Egyptian television. And the Egyptian moderator is asking him, saying, how do you regret October 7th given what has happened in Gaza? The question alone tells us something very important about what might be happening in the consciousness of much of the Arab world. Was this really worth it? Why is, in the same way that, was it really worth trying to destroy Israel in 1948? That didn't work out so good, as we used to say in Brooklyn. And so there really is something that's playing out here, which is complicated. There isn't a simple answer. I think Hamas has lost ground. I think October 7th is still seen as an act of resistance. That may change as well. Whether this will translate into a greater willingness to consider a peaceful end to the conflict, at this moment, I'm skeptical.
The next 3 questions all deal with Netanyahu. So in no particular order, this one asks, do you think that the war could have been and can be conducted or would be conducted differently if somebody else were the prime minister, Benny Gantz or others were in power? There's more questions. That's another Netanyahu question. Why don't we stay with just that one for a second?
The first one.
Yeah.
Basically, no. The war cabinet, and this is something that is also not widely understood abroad. There are essentially 2 cabinets today. There's the general cabinet and there's the condensed war cabinet. And the far right has been kept out of the war cabinet, much to its frustration. They have absolutely no impact on the decision-making of the Gaza war. And the small number of people, of ministers sitting in the war cabinet are, with the exception of Netanyahu, people that I trust a great deal. Now, Netanyahu is not the decisive voice in determining how this war is being fought. It is the war cabinet as a whole, and it is the army. The army, the leadership of the army, despite October 7th, is widely admired and appreciated in Israel. Everyone agrees that the leadership has to go, the political leadership and also the military leadership. But whereas most of us can't wait to see the backs of the political leadership, that's not true with the military leadership. There's going to be a great deal of angst when Yossi Halevi resigns. He has to resign, but it's a tragedy for Israel. It's a tragedy for the army because he's been terrific. And so I think this war is in good hands. I don't believe it would be fought substantially differently if any of the members of the war cabinet were in Netanyahu's place. It's a fairly interchangeable group. And again, Netanyahu is one of half dozen members of the cabinet.
And I think I spoke with you about this in my study. Do you think that Chuck Schumer's speech has helped Bibi in any way, or what effect has it had in Israel?
Well, I think that's the right question, not whether he had a right to say it. He had a right to say whatever he wanted. And certainly, again, the Biden administration has earned the right to critique Israel. We don't have to agree with everything they say. I personally agreed with him about this. And the only question that I had and still have is whether Schumer's speech was good for Netanyahu or not. My sense is that Israelis tend to be unhappy when their political leaders endanger the American-Israeli relationship, especially during war. So I don't know if the speech made a great deal of difference one way or the other. I think those who want to see him go still want to see him go. And the 5 people left in the state of Israel who want to see him stay are more determined than ever as a result of Schumer's rebuke. So.
Another Yossi with questions. This is Yossi also. Talking about the day after, whenever that is, a couple of questions here. One is, how do we ever disentangle Israel from the West Bank? The other is, what does winning this war look like? And lastly, and this is one that's been running through my mind as well, history tells us that the state of Israel has, lasts 80 years. We're at 75, 76 years. Why will we see it, or why will it be different this time around?
Why will what be different?
Why will Israel survive that 80-year cycle this time around?
Oh, meaning that in ancient Israel, we didn't go past 80 years. The precedent of Israel losing its national sovereignty in ancient Israel and Judea, and the eerie coincidence of these 80-year cycles where we maintained national sovereignty only for 2 80-year periods, and now here we are coming up to 80 years, is haunting. But I don't necessarily see that as an ironclad rule of Jewish history. And the fact that we were able to come together to the extent that we were on October 8th, after tearing ourselves apart for a year, really surprised me. If you would have asked me during this last year, before October 7th, would it be possible for us to ever come together again, to fight together in the same tank? Someone who voted for Ben Gvir, someone who voted for Yair Lapid. Is it possible that we're the same people anymore? Do I feel a connection to people who supported this government? That was an open question for me. And October 8th resolved that question. And so we have not unlearned the habit of peoplehood. That's a tremendous self-revelation. And something similar has happened in parts of the diaspora, maybe large parts of the diaspora. I ran into a rabbi, a friend of mine, at Ben Gurion Airport when I was coming here. And he said he's writing a book called The Great Awakening about how American Jewry has rediscovered its solidarity, its Jewishness. Now, obviously, there are significant exceptions to this pattern, and we have to acknowledge that. But I think that by and large, we are responding as a very healthy people. And so I think our instincts are strong. We have a growing part of the Jewish people whose instincts are not healthy. In Israel, it's expressed by the radical right, the anti-democratic right. And in North America, especially the United States, it's expressed by the anti-Zionist Jewish left. And so you have these two polar forces, one growing in Israel, one growing in North America, which are really trying to tear us apart. One, in Israel, we have a force saying that the notion of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is not relevant for a country under siege. We need to dispense with democracy. And in the United States, you have growing numbers of young Jews saying the idea of a Jewish state is anachronistic or immoral, and it's only Israel as a democratic state that matters. And so that's a great danger to the future of the Jewish people. But I believe that a strong mainstream will hold, and so I think we will get to the 81st year of the state of Israel.
So, Yossi, last three questions, sort of related, I guess. What can be done? What is Israel doing, and are they doing enough regarding hostages and bringing them home? What is Israel's responsibility for the humanitarian crisis in Gaza? And then the last question, is this a good time to visit Israel?
It's the spring. It's very beautiful, especially on the Gaza border. There are these fields of poppies. It's quite beautiful. I'm not going to answer that last question. In terms of Israel's responsibility for the humanitarian crisis, we're not guilty, but we're responsible. And responsible means that we need to take responsibility. We are beginning to. The discourse is changing in Israel, but it's changing, honestly, largely in response to pressure, especially from Biden and to some extent from our other remaining friends, Germany, which has really stood with Israel, more so than almost any European country. We're getting some pressure from Germany, and I think we need to listen to them as well, as disconcerting as it is to admit that for the son of a Holocaust survivor. So I think that what has changed is that the Israeli public, the government, or parts of the government, have internalized that we actually won't be able to continue fighting this war if we don't mollify our friends. So it's still on that level. I wish it were on the level of we're a Jewish state. We have to take responsibility for our power. And that, I think, is an expression. The fact that it isn't that is an expression of still a certain immaturity, a certain inability to take full responsibility for the consequences of power. But I do think the discourse is changing, and it's less defensive. It's less, we're not doing the count of how many trucks we're allowing into Gaza. Now it's really more serious. We have an emergency on our hands. What do we need to do? And finally, the question of the hostages, and that's a very good place to end. One of the reasons why we are still in October 7th, of course, is the hostages. The hostages are still in October 7th. And the nightmare for thousands of Israelis has lingered. And that really is expressed emotionally throughout the society. The problem of the hostages is that the practical question of the hostages is that we are confronted with a clash of two essential Israeli values. The first value is we leave no one behind on the battlefield. And that's a value that's deeply rooted in Jewish history. Pidyon Shvuim, the redemption of captives, defined the Jewish people through 2,000 years of exile. You never leave a Jew in captivity. And that Jewish ethos became the Israeli ethos. It became the IDF's ethos. And so that, on the one hand, is an inviolate principle. On the other hand, self-defense. How do you not prioritize the destruction of the regime that committed October 7th? And so what happens when these two values clash? What happens if Hamas will insist that no hostages will be released unless the war ends and Hamas is allowed to stay in power? Israelis are very divided over that question. And many of us are internally divided. It's not just two camps within Israeli society. It's two camps within many of us. And I don't know. I don't have an answer. I do know that I find myself uncomfortably agreeing with Netanyahu when he opposes the demonstrations for the hostages. And I think that he's right in that Hamas sees these demonstrations and takes that as a signal that Israeli society can be broken, and it ups the price. I think that the approach of hitting Hamas harder and harder, getting to the leaders, is what will bring the price down. And if you think about the initial agreements, the hostage trade that we had, those first 3 or 4 agreements, those were the most advantageous trade-offs that Israel has ever had. Think of the 2011 deal with Gilad Shalit, where we gave 1,000 terrorists, including Sinwar, and hundreds of Hamas terrorists who participated in October 7th. How many Israelis paid for their lives because of the Shalit trade? And that's also in the minds of Israelis. So we are confronted with a typically Israeli dilemma where there is no good solution. I am leaning increasingly toward the argument that so much has been broken in Israeli society that we can't break this last foundational element of the Israeli ethos, which is that we take care of each other. If we, God forbid, allow the hostages to die in captivity, then something very elemental will have broken in Israel. And that might have more strategic consequences in terms of alienating many, allowing the regime to remain in power. But that's how I feel at this moment, and it changes. And I think that's true for Israeli society generally. Thank you very much.
Yossi, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you again to Jewish Federation and to CIJA and to the Rav and to our congregational partners, Sharat Tzedek, Beth Israel, Beth Tikva, and Temple Shalom, and to all of you. Thank you for coming tonight. Reminder, there is a rally at 2 o'clock at the Art Gallery on Sunday. Please drive safely. Thank you.